There are 2 wheelchair-accessible washrooms on this level, adjacent to the main entrance, and there are additional facilities on the church's lower level. In the highly unlikely event of an emergency, there are exits in each corner of the sanctuary leading to sidewalk, garden, and Highway 10. But please use the highway side doors only in an emergency. Lastly, the usual friendly reminder and admonition about phones and other noisemakers. Thank you. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, 6 Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat Wyandot Wyandot peoples, on whose traditional territories we gather and whose ancestors signed treaties with our ancestors. We also recognize the Métis and Inuit whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples.
I guess that means we're on. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. We bid you a welcome to this Friends of the South Grey Museum Speaker Series. A speaker series which has been host to a great number of ultra-interesting presentations, subjects with exceptional presenters, and today is no exception. Curtis Hawkes, Sopwith Camels and Pups, Fokker Triplanes, Newports and Jennies. These are the names which captured the imaginations of many young Canadians for 2 or 3 generations at least. In the late 50s and early 60s, I was one of many spending numerous hours in my bedroom making plastic models of Billy Bishop's Newport 17 or of Rick Toven's Fokker D-1 triplane, the Red Baron. World War I, the Great War, the world's first air war. There was a revolution being created up above the horrors of the trenches. Airplanes, a new and still experimental technology, were developing quickly to change battle strategies, to change the face of warfare. Legendary First World War pilots, Billy Bishop, Barker, names the Canadians all know. Billy Bishop wrote about his experiences at Vimy. He wrote, "Flying into a wall of sleet and steel was an exercise in sheer horror." Vimy Ridge, the battle at which, it was correctly said, Canada became a nation recognized by the world. It would actually be given, our country would be given, the right to have signatures on the Treaty of Versailles as an independent country, as opposed to simply a colony of Great Britain. The battle saw unprecedented numbers of innovations, of soldiers who were wounded and who died, innovations such as the aircraft, balloons, geophones to listen to tunnelers, the enemy tunnel diggers next to them. This evening's presentation will delve into the role of aircraft during that battle. However, before we listen to the presentation, allow me to tell you a little bit about our Renaissance speaker. I say Renaissance because her interests, experience, and knowledge base encompass a diverse range that I would like to share some of that with you. Natalie McHaffie was born in Deep River, Ontario, north of Pembroke and Ottawa. Actually, it's famous for being the home of a clock museum. She grew up in Toronto and started her career as a sculptor. She has works in such diverse places as British Columbia, Alaska, and Cambridge, Waterloo. Her sculpture entitled Solo was installed at Devonian Harbor Park in 1986 as a part of Vancouver's Centennial Sculpture Symposium. Made of stainless steel and carved cedar planks, they fan out in a spiral. With her interest in all things aeronautical, she stated that the sculpture was meant to show movement, but not necessarily flight. I quote, "My perception of the world is that very little of it is stable, and it is fluid." She stated that in the Vancouver Sun of July 19th, 1986. She continued her quote by saying, "I can't get flight out of my mind when I view this work. My favorite aspects of the sculpture are the colored feathers of the wings and the light patterns created on the metal." Natalie has been an instructor at the Ontario College of Arts and Design University on McCall Street in Toronto. She's been the general manager at the Toronto Aerospace Museum. She's been the program and exhibits manager for the Gulf of Georgia Cannery and Fishing Museum in British Columbia. Natalie also authored a young adult's book entitled Sea Growl, The Daring Little Airplane. It's a story which, in logbook form, takes the reader on a worldwide flight in the cockpit of a de Havilland chipmunk. She's currently curator of the Great War Flying Museum. Located in Brampton, Caledon Airport, it's the only living history museum in Canada dedicated to honoring and to preserving the contributions of World War I veterans. The Great War Flying Museum is an all-volunteer organization that has been active at the Brampton Caledon Airport for at least 50 years. Natalie is also a licensed pilot of renown who started flying in her early 40s. She's a member of the Canadian 99s, which is an Oklahoma-based international organization of women pilots, and there are chapters of it throughout Canada. A licensed pilot who owns 2 Curtiss Pitt biplanes, she's been flying in aerobatic competitions for over 25 years. One of the highlights was in 2001 at an international aerobatics club competition. She was the only woman pilot to place in the winner's circle with an 80.55% point average. She placed 4th in the sportsman class, only 3% points out of first place. Currently living in the country near Alliston, she has 3 grown children. And rounding out her life, she built 2 nutshell prams, these are small sailboats, in her living room for her grandchildren. Grandson Yang's boat, named the Yankipu, has an inlaid transom with the boat's name and a dragon's logo. The bow of her granddaughter Claire's boat, called the Clarabelle, is decorated with the name, a dolphin, and a knotted rope border carved out of solid teak. She is an artist/instructor with Inner City Angels, a nonprofit group in Toronto that brings artists and children together throughout the city and mostly in local elementary schools. Speak about an interesting Renaissance-style life. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Natalie McHaffie.
Ooh. That's a bright light. Is it going to continue straight in my face the whole time? I guess so. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. It's a little scary, and it includes a certain amount of what I was going to say tonight anyway, so you'll get it twice. Special thank you to all the 99s who are here. It is wonderful to see you and to see you out supporting me. Really special to see you. I'm going to start with a little about aircraft in the Great War. Then I'll show you some recently acquired artifacts that spurred my research on aircraft at Vimy, followed by more detail about the specific aircraft and their role during that battle in the spring of 1917. Over 4 days, Canadian soldiers fought and died at Vimy Ridge to secure a major German defensive position. And I'll do an interesting aside at this point. At this point, I said, as you know, over 4 days. My oldest son said, no, Nat, any high school student does not know in Canada, you do. But looking at tonight's audience, I would say most of you have at least heard about Vimy. Though it was primarily a battle fought by foot soldiers and artillery, both preparation for the battle and support during the battle required heavily on aircraft. No, that's in no way what I would expect. Ta-da! The Great War was the world's first air war, and when the war started, flying was in its first decade. And although all the major European powers had started work on developing military aircraft, flying was barely out of the experimental stage. In late 1914, the Allies had approximately 460 military aircraft. Germany and Austria-Hungary had about 300, and all were barely more than powered kites. This captured German Taube, considered a successful fighter in early 1915, carried a handheld pistol and a few 1 or 2 pound bombs. But a Taube like this is noteworthy for bombing a Japanese warship as early as October 1914. Aircraft had yet to develop the power to carry a great deal of payload, like oxygen equipment or radio transmitters. Most flew with rotary engines, which limited their range. Their engines and guns frequently jammed or quit during flight. Aircraft were so new that adequate pilot training was still a thing of the future. But their ability to see long distances into enemy territory was revolutionary. Their main value lay in aerial reconnaissance. For example, in the first month of World War I, at the Battle of the Marne, 2 airplanes were sent out to report on the advances of the German army. One spotted the Germans marching in an encircling maneuver, and this information gave the French and British generals time to redirect defensive troops, which stopped the German offensive before it achieved its goal of taking Paris. Thus, an observation plane affected battle strategy from the very start. Ta-da. By the end of 1916, only a year and a half later, Allied observation planes had developed to the point where they were photographing the entire front line from the English Channel to the Italian Alps every 10 days. We rarely hear about the developers or interpreters of those millions of glass plates, so here's one example that illustrates their valued place in the trail that leads from aircraft reconnaissance to ground troop action. In 1917, planes noticed increased action around a village over 30 miles behind the front lines. Further photos identified extensive activity in the area and details in the village. Beside the largest village, a light circle in the grass indicated that horses were being walked to cool down, and therefore, at a time when horses were in desperate demand to pull artillery and supplies, this meant that the villa was occupied by someone of importance. Behind the villa's stable, a deep oval indicated a full troop of horses being exercised. On the other side of the town, a figure 8 in the grass showed that they were lancers because lancers practice lunging left and right. This narrowed down who occupied the main house to one of 3 generals. And behind the village was a new set of trenches. Given their location so far from the front, these were practice trenches for an assault. The photo interpreters matched the images of the practice trenches with the exact location on the Allied trenches. And by putting all the photographic evidence together, the interpreters concluded which general, leading approximately how many troops, would attack at which location, on which date, and they were right. Aerial observation and photo interpreters led to a successful ground troop defense against a German attack. As well as aircraft, observation balloons used an extensive number of tethered balloons. In an era when radio transmitters were too heavy for the underpowered aircraft to carry, tethered balloons had the advantage of direct telephone communication with the ground. And the disadvantages of vulnerability to attack and lack of mobility. This is one of my favorite photos. Yes. The need to protect one's own observation planes and balloons and to prevent the enemy from aerial spying led to aircraft designs that were more maneuverable and better armed, the fighters, or scouts as they were called. And the purpose of these fighters was primarily to protect one's own reconnaissance planes or attack the enemy's reconnaissance planes. The World War II parallel was the role of fighters defending against enemy bombers or protecting your own bombers against enemy fighters. In both wars, fighters attacked or protected. Dogfights, while glorious and wonderful for propaganda and morale, were a maneuver in the fight against the effectiveness of observation or bomber aircraft. By the end of the Great War, aircraft had been developed for specific roles, from huge bombers to deadly fighters, and the new dimension of aerial warfare had become indispensable to how battles on the ground were fought. As mentioned before, the Great War Flying Museum on Brampton, Caledon Airport. GWFM builds and flies full-scale recreations of World War I aircraft in their big hangar. A smaller building on the right, built to look like a wartime communications hut, houses a fascinating collection of Great War artifacts. As mentioned, I have quite a background in arts and museums, so, skipping fast, not long after I joined the museum, I found myself the curator of a neglected, undocumented, miscellaneous collection full of aviation stuff through to the 1980s. But hidden in the dust were some true treasures. So I raised some grants, and our museum members put in a ton of hard work renovating the building. Our museum's collection comes from donations. Some of them are truly unique. We have a few aviation artifacts that I have never seen in any other aviation museum. Recently, we were given a collection from Cuthbert Pirrett Coatsworth by his son, not his grandson. Although the war ended just over 100 years ago, for some, the Great War is just one generation in the past. CP, as he was known, left engineering at University of Toronto to serve with the 2nd Canadian Pioneers Brigade. During battles, he laid telephone cables and rescued wounded men from no man's land, for which he received the Military Cross. But primarily, he made maps, including ones that recorded the positions of German trenches. His collection of about 50 items includes a souvenir German Mauser gun, which he smuggled back to Canada. And this is a complete aside, but I love doing this with all the kids who come into the museum. That particular gun, known as a broom-handled Mauser, is in fact the blaster that was used in Star Wars. On the line of, a good design is always a good design, no matter how many years it goes. However, and I can tell you, when these came in, all the guys at the museum went, gun. I went, maps. You should see the maps. Of greater interest are his compass and his watch, which were used in surveying, and the real treasure, his personal sketches of a trench network on the left, and his handwritten notes on converting reconnaissance data into maps. These are gold. There are 4 of his maps, dated from the time of Vimy. One details which, is that the right way up? Yes. One details which German brigades, the one on the left, faced the Canadians along the Vimy battlefield. This way you know whether you are facing experienced troops, new troops, worn-out troops. It's very important to know who you're facing. Another shows the German trench network at Vimy. On the right, the map of the German trench network is hand-drawn in red ink over a pre-printed black and white map. And if you look at it, you have to take an extreme magnifying glass to know. Those map makers were real artists. Trench raids, balloons, and aircraft gathered the data to compile the Vimy maps. But how to showcase these Vimy maps and yet fit our museum's mandate to present the history of aviation during the Great War? For people like tonight's gathering and myself, the significance of Vimy is part of our common identity. However, Vimy was fought over a century ago, so many of our museum visitors in Brampton know little about the battle. As well as my son said, yeah, Vimy was a small part of grade 9 history when you were asleep. As well, we are located near Brampton. Many of our visitors at the Great War Flying Museum are new Canadians. For them, Vimy is a complete unknown. And though the aerial reconnaissance was indispensable, I found that even members at the Great War Flying Museum were unaware that any aircraft participated at Vimy. Similarly, historian Tim Cook's book on Vimy mentions aircraft in only 3 sentences and has just 2 aviation titles in its 30-page bibliography. The Coatsworth maps motivated me to delve deeper into the role that aircraft played at Vimy. My focus soon developed into a wish to present the little-told story of aerial observation. Using the Coatsworth maps, I have added 2 small displays at the museum that highlight some of my research. Vimy was the first time that the Allies had won a major battle since the start of the war. So we ask ourselves, what gave the Canadian Corps success where the British and French attempts had failed? One of the deciding factors in Canada's success at Vimy was in preparation. An example that most of us have heard of was the practice which every Canadian soldier took, walking to a timetable through a full-scale mock-up of the ground that they would cross and the defenses that they would encounter when they advanced on the day of the battle. Those thousands of details for that mock-up came from 3 sources: prisoner interrogation, trench raids, and most thoroughly from photos taken by aircraft. Have I got the right photo? Yes. This photo, taken by Canadian Corbould, shows that he is flying quite low, low enough that you can see his shadow and that of the flak artillery firing at him. I'm told there's a little pointer. Aha, there's his shadow. Flights like this were the culmination of 3 years of wartime aircraft development and provided essential information to artillery divisions, both before and during the battle. Another factor was the use of Canadian planners made of new technology. Air-to-ground communication by radio was largely inadequate at the time, as radio transmitters were too heavy for the frail airplanes. However, the Canadians developed aircraft artillery coordination that was pretty well entirely new. I have read of one general making the comment that to a gunner, anything is a target. The idea that you had to aim your gun was a little over the top. Aerial photography was refined with lighter weight cameras built into the aircraft. Sonar ranging for the artillery was so new as to be experimental. Together, they helped perfect the tactic of the creeping artillery barrage, in which the ground troops advanced behind a moving wall of artillery shells. No? Aha. In the Great War, an artillery gun had been manufactured to deliver 1,000 shots in the lifetime of the barrel. Leading up to Vimy, the guns were sending 1,000 shots every day. To retain accuracy, aircraft and sonar were used for the first time to calibrate every gun prior to the battle. This was a decisive factor in the success of the rolling barrage. Different terrains and defenses could be accounted for in the aim of the barrage line, and its accuracy was reported back to headquarters in real time by aircraft during the battle. Now, for the first time, through extensive practice and collaboration with aircraft reporting and photo recording, a gun could accurately hit a target well beyond their line of sight. I'll give a decisive example of this later. The attacking artillery and the rolling artillery barrage depended on aircraft reconnaissance for planning. Aircraft artillery coordination to refine aim and distance was a new technique, which required extensive training and coordination planning. The detailed and extensive artillery techniques that were developed by Canadians for Vimy were employed by all the Allies to the end of the war. The air battle began long before the first soldier went over the top. In the skies over the entire Vimy Arras sector, the Royal Flying Corps of the Royal Naval Air Service waged a brutal and costly battle to support Allied ground operations from mid-February until the day before the attack. Canada did not have an independent air force at this time, but about 30% of the pilots in the Royal Air Force squadrons at Vimy were Canadians, including well-known aces Billy Bishop, Red Mulock, and Joseph Fall. As an example of how important observation was to the higher command, 2/3 of the squadrons operating in the Vimy Arras sector were devoted to reconnaissance and artillery spotting. These were hazardous tasks because of the need to fly at low speeds and slow speeds and low altitudes. And prior to the battle, General Trenchard stressed the need to take the war into enemy territory. Fighters were to penetrate, seek, and destroy. This meant that slower reconnaissance machines got even less fighter protection. Additionally, the prevailing winds that blew from west to east made it that much more difficult for a flyer in trouble to get back to friendly lines. Pilots for these dangerous but critical missions flew a mix of outdated aircraft armed with a single unsynchronized machine gun. A synchronized fixed forward-facing machine gun was fired through the propeller between the spinning blades. Someone who understands engineering more than me understands this. This was more accurate and immediate as it allowed the pilot to aim the airplane at the enemy. In addition, according to Canadian ace Raymond Collishaw, the belt-fed Vickers was slow to respond. He said, "We found that when we got into combat, there was a casual put-put sound, almost like a motorcycle about to expire." Now, if you look at the FE-8, it's hard to imagine that that's much more than a development of the Wright brothers' first flyer. Allied reconnaissance aircraft at Vimy included the types shown here. They were supported by scout or fighter squadrons operating Airco's, FE-8th, and Newport 17th, although their support was often diverted to attack sorties into enemy territory. And by 1917, none of these were recent designs. In the fast pace of wartime development, all were outdated. And as I said, you can see that some of them, the DH-2, that was considered a forward fighter by the Allies at that time. This big, yes, it works. Anyway, the sort of cage at the top there was considered a top-level fighter. Try the right button, yes. A limited number of newer designs, such as the Sopwith triplane, Sopwith Pup, and Spad 7, reached the front. However, they were engaged mostly in the capacity of fighters in enemy territory. In the months from mid-February to mid-April, 316 Allied aircraft were downed, 45 of which were Canadians. The heavy losses can be blamed on inferior aircraft, but of equal importance, you can blame the of equal importance to the German advanced aircraft was the formation in the late fall and early winter of 1916-17 of Jagdstaffels, or Jastas, fighter squadrons trained in group attack tactics. Allied sorties into German territory now met dedicated fighter interception by large groups of aircraft, often led by experienced aces such as Manfred von Richthofen and his flying circus. In contrast to those open ones that look like a Wright Brothers flyer, the German, opposing the British aircrew, were cutting-edge aircraft designed with rapid-fire machine guns, synchronized, and roughly half of the German Jastas were equipped with faster, stronger, better-armed Albatros and Halberstadt fighters. The Albatros D series is recognizable by its aerodynamic design, including a strong, lightweight plywood structure and a smoothly faired nose cone. Combined with twin synchronized machine guns and a more powerful engine, they were more than a match for the Allied fighters and lethal on slow reconnaissance machines. The D2 typifies the constantly changing technology of the war with side-mounted air brakes to rapidly reduce speed. If someone is changing you, you can stop in the air, they'll scoot right past you. One of the other, I guess, that I hadn't included, but one of the other things about the way the German fighters were built is that the Germans had a much better grasp of how to manufacture thousands of airplanes quickly. In World War I, they used, both the Allies and the Germans separately used about 1,500 airplanes every month at the front. So building fast was a big deal. The British built wings, for example, out of hundreds of little pieces of wood, nicely put together. The Germans built the ribs by taking plywood and using machine-run routers to cut pieces out. The British airplanes achieved some of the aerodynamics of their wings by making every rib a slightly different shape. The Germans made them all identical for speed. There were a number of manufacturing things, as well as, of course, the beauty of those smooth plywood skins. Whoops, let's go back. Yeah. Where the few Allied squadrons equipped with Spads or Sopwith triplanes were capable of meeting the Germans on somewhat equal terms, the outcome of the fight often rested with the skill of the aircrew in defending itself from the group tactics of the fighter Jasta. And when shot down, a pilot's survival was dictated by how close he was to enemy friendly territory and the prevailing wind. The agile Fokker triplane, which we all have heard about, was still a thing of the future at Vimy. The first successful fighter triplane was the English Sopwith triplane, and it was so successful that actually the German higher-ups asked Fokker to design a triplane to counter it, and that's the one we all know. But von Richthofen flew at Vimy in an all-red airplane. It was an Albatros, and all the members of his famous Jasta 11 carried some sort of red markings. Jasta 11 accounted for more than a third of the British losses. The most potent weapon during the First World War was artillery. However, the artillery relied heavily upon the new technologies of aircraft and refined aerial cameras. In the months leading up to Vimy Ridge, Corps squadrons, those air units tasked to provide direct reconnaissance support to a specific Army corps, were in the air whenever the weather permitted, photographing and rephotographing German positions. If a target to be photographed was deemed important enough, the Royal Flying Corps would do whatever it took to get the image. For example, one mission over the span of 2 days in late March 1917 resulted in the loss of 14 airmen killed and missing, and the required information was never obtained. 25 squadrons patrolled and photographed the battlefield, strafed trenches, and recorded enemy movements. The squadron had from 8 to 24 planes, and at Vimy, the Royal Flying Corps started with 365 planes, nearly twice as many planes as the Germans had there. But the superior German aircraft and gunnery took its toll. In just the last 4 days before the Canadian Corps assault on the 9th, flying accidents and German attacks downed more than a third of the Allied planes. One bright spot in this dismal air scenario was the assignment of Canadian Redford Muloch's Naval 3 Squadron to the Western Front. Almost entirely Canadian, it was credited with destroying 80 aircraft that spring. In February and March, number 16 reconnaissance squadrons and number 1-2 balloon companies plotted 180 of 212 German batteries. Over the course of 1 month's fighting, approximately 245 aircraft were lost at the cost of 211 crew killed and 108 prisoners of war. But despite the high casualty rates, their persistence paid off. In the opening 1.5 hours of the battle on April 9th, 80% of the big German guns were taken out by Canadian gunners. This ensured that most of the advance did not face big gun artillery fire. Here are just 2 examples of the type of work aircraft undertook prior to the battle. They come from letters to his wife by British pilot Arthur Gough Lee, written on April 8th, the day before the attack. Sunday, beautiful weather again. The Germans had wired the gaps between huge craters in the 10th Battalion's planned line of attack. Ground observation showed the wire to have been blown out, but an airplane was sent up to confirm. Its photographs showed the wire was intact, but disguised by mud. An extra barrage was laid on, which destroyed it in time for Monday's attack. Sunday, on patrol at 9 a.m., Billy Bishop and number 60 Squadron got into a running fight and took on 8 enemy aircraft in total. At one time, 5 at once, damaging several and bringing down 2. He also brought back the information of thousands of German reserves moving forward to the active defense lines. In just 3/4 of an hour on a sunny Sunday morning, Bishop had done the work of an entire squadron. Go on. Small thing, and take a look at the size of shells that are being shot up at the aircraft. If you hit one, there wasn't much left. Although there had been perfect flying weather on April 8th, by the time the whistle blew to signal the attack, the following morning, the sky over Vimy was filled with low clouds, rain, and snow showers. As mentioned, Billy Bishop wrote, flying into a wall of sleet and steel at 50 feet was an exercise in terror. The dangers were not just enemy fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft gunfire. On that Monday morning alone, the first day of the battle, 4 Allied aircraft were shot down by getting too low and getting hit by their own barrage. Additionally, the tons of flying metal in the barrage caused an artificial wind, intensifying the turbulence and sleet. Then from April 9th to the 12th, the control of the battle depended on runners, who were often killed or literally bogged down, and aircraft, which, if they weren't shot down, could relay their reports to headquarters more quickly than runners. At times when the reporting aircraft was shot down by ground fire, confusion added to the difficulties of the advancing troops. For example, when the 4th Division was slowed down by mud and bomb craters, the men got too far behind the barrage. Their reporting aircraft had been destroyed, and no direction for change to the momentum of the artillery barrage could come from headquarters. So the German machine gunners were able to get out of their dugouts in time to stop the 4th Division advance. More positively, a report from the 1st Brigade reports that when the brigade reached the trench that was its second objective at 11:15, they signaled their position to a reporting aircraft. This allowed the timing of the creeping barrage to start its next phase. To get that signal, the observation aircraft had to fly low enough to identify the brigade color signal. Remember Billy Bishop's comment about the terror of flying at 50 feet above the ground. 50 feet is lower than treetop level. Not that there were any trees left at Vimy by then, and it was well within the range of enemy machine gun and rifle fire. Nope. As the battle continued, aircraft reported on objectives taken, directed changes in the barrage when necessary, and pinpointed new threats for the artillery to target. A few examples. German soldier Hagemann was the one man of the German 1st Battalion that returned from the forward line facing the Canadian mounted rifles on April 9th. His report says, the German artillery was directed at the old enemy position and went over the heads of the mass of Canadian infantry and did no harm to it. The enemy artillery, on the other hand, was directed during the entire attack by means of very lights from observation planes. As a result, the fire was well placed, and as the attack made progress, it was always just forward of the British infantry, causing heavy German casualties. And an example of target identification occurred with the taking of the Pimple, a separate height which could fire down on the north end of Vimy Ridge. When the French took the Pimple in 1916, they were rapidly repulsed by reinforcements brought up from behind the hill. With the Pimple retaken, the Germans could control the rest of Vimy Ridge. When the Nova Scotia Highlanders took the Pimple on April 12th in 1917, an aircraft spotted the German reinforcements on their way and directed Canadian artillery fire, which annihilated them. Vimy was a complex attack that was more thoroughly planned than previous battles. And there are many factors that contributed to the Canadian success. But one of the big factors was our use of aircraft. They pinpointed all the German defenses. They collected the data for mapping the artillery barrage. They acted as real-time controls of targets and troop advances during the battle, and they coordinated artillery aiming. Aircraft don't win battles, but they do make it so the men on the ground can. The pressure of war changed flying from flimsy experiments to sophisticated role-specific aircraft. And in the process, aircraft changed how war was fought. They added a third dimension, one of hugely increased speed and distance. By 1920, an entire new dimension, the sky, had been added to our worldview. Thank you.
If there are any questions, we have time for about 6 questions. And I or Natalie will repeat the questions so everybody can hear it. Actually, Natalie will.
If she hears them.
If you can hear it.
Sorry.
Were the Germans doing the same thing on our side of the lines, reconnaissance?
Sorry. Were the Germans doing the same thing on our side in terms of? Oh, absolutely. When I say the purpose of fighter aircraft was to attack or protect our reconnaissance aircraft, that's also why the Germans developed their fighter aircraft. After a while, of course, it became fighters fighting fighters, because otherwise you can't protect or whatever. And also because General Trenchard asked that fighters at that stage of the war should penetrate Germany. That sort of aggressive rather than defensive position changed back and forth through the war, but at the time of Vimy, a lot of the fighter squadrons were sent over that way, and their purpose tended to be glorious. Everybody loves a good dogfight.
Would you have any idea what type of aircraft the Russian night witches were flying?
Sorry, any air that a Russian,
Night witches were flying?
they were Second World War? The Night Witches were the Second World War, I think. In the First World War, there were 9 frontline pilots among the Allies, frontline women pilots, and most of them were Russian. Almost all of them were, of course, wealthy women who had got their licenses before the war. And one of them was the lovely story of an American woman who flew with the Bulgarians as a man, and it wasn't until she was wounded that they discovered she was a woman. So, you know, to be a woman on the front lines in the First World War was very rare.
This is really more of a question, but more of a statement. Do you find that the advancements of drone warfare is mirroring the advancements of flight itself?
I'm such a, did you get that? Please.
The question was, is the advancement of ground warfare, does it mirror the advancement of flight?
Unlikely in that, of course, ground warfare had been going on a long time.
Drone warfare.
Sorry?
Drone.
Oh, drone warfare.
Drone warfare is in its infancy as is flight.
Yeah, and it also is changing the way war is being waged. Any new technology is, whether your new technology is simply sonar or radar or whatever, every new technology makes a leap in a different direction for the way that war is being fought. And for some reason, we don't stop fighting.
For the 100th anniversary, Canada flew replica U-boats and SU-5 over Monument and the Ridge. There was a volunteer group, I think they were from British Columbia. Did you know what happened to those airplanes? Did they ever come back?
They came back. The person leading that was Alan Snowy, who is actually a member of our museum. And they attempted to do a cross-country flight as part of a sort of memorial, whatever. Some of the planes made it. None of them were full-scale replicas. They were 7/8 scale replicas. But nonetheless, at least we got airplanes that looked like the right sort of thing flying over the Vimy Memorial at the time. Yes.
Still a nice tribute to
A very nice tribute, and Alan made the effort to get together the funding to take them over. They are, of course, small enough that if you take their wings off, you can put them in the bottom of an airplane. But, yeah. Yes, that was a really nice tribute. It was indeed. I'm trying to think if any of them is still flying. I think maybe a couple of them are on the West Coast. Yeah. I see another
What
hand.
was the average top speed of these planes during the war?
They usually reached about 100 to 120 miles an hour. The very fast ones by the end of the war were doing 200. A Zeppelin was going as fast and, of course, could go a whole lot higher and could stop and bomb where it wanted to bomb. They were the super weapon of the time. They were also probably enormously expensive to build and very vulnerable to the weather. But as far as air power goes, the Zeppelin was probably way ahead of most aircraft. They were just as fast. In fact, total speed, of course, makes no difference. It's just a question of whether you're faster than the other person. And if you're flying something like a pup, Sopwith pup, if you're over 15,000 feet, you have an advantage, for whatever reason for the design. Below 10,000 feet, The other airplanes were faster, and all you could do was go around in very tight circles and try and get on his tail. Which brings up the aspect of over 15,000 feet. Although they were expected to fly below treetop height over the battlefield, pilots on reconnaissance duty were also expected to fly 20 to 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet. So they all suffered from altitude sickness. They also flew behind rotary engines, which spew castor oil at them the whole time, so they all had the mums. And they had about a tenth of the lifetime expectancy of a man on the ground. So although we have this big dogfight hero aces thing, being a pilot was probably not the winning choice. Sorry, I can't see a thing through that light.
Why were the triplanes superior? And if they were superior, why did they die out for in preference to the biplane?
They have a limit in strength, so as you get bigger and bigger. But in the First World War, that limit certainly wasn't reached. The Italians had a big bomber plane that had, I think it's 8 engines. It was, God, it's huge. I mean, you see pictures of it, it's enormous. But part of the trouble with a triplane is that you have to either have a really strong cantilevered structure, which the Fokker triplane did, and the only reason that there are struts between the wings on the Fokker triplane is that the pilots at the time insisted on them. The first Fokker triplane experimental did not have those struts. The big Italian bombers as triplanes, gosh, I mean, literally 2 football fields long. They were enormous. And all the wings were wired together, of course, to keep them stiff. And the story goes that if you had finished rigging, wiring your wings, and a chicken could get out, you hadn't done it right.
They have that on the high parachute Air Force aircraft.
Sorry?
High parachute aircraft regime, the Navy oil, they have that feed bomber.
That's a
So,
full-size replica?
it's a
Whoa.
real thing. It's a real thing.
It's always amazing how big some of these airplanes are. Yeah. Yeah, even the single-seaters, some of them are surprisingly big. Yes. Last question, and, sorry. Yes?
When were parachutes introduced?
If you were up in a Zeppelin, you had parachutes. People had been using parachutes for quite a bit of time before that. And if you were on a balloon, tethered balloon, you had a parachute. Partly because, of course, they attack a balloon and it isn't moving, it's easy to attack, except for the ring of guns around it trying to catch the attacker. And, you know, they burned up very quickly. The reason that they didn't go into airplanes, really hard to know. I've just finished reading a book called No Parachute by a man who was a pilot through the First World War and who eventually became an Air Vice Marshal. So he was very much into the policy as well. And he says there is no accounting for it. There's nothing in any of the records, either in the British or other allies' headquarters directives, that says you can't use parachutes. They would be awkward and tight in those little airplanes, but then they were awkward and tight, and if it was going to save your life, you would have worn it. A lot of the pilots in the First World War felt that a parachute should have been issued. There was no doubt they had parachutes, and they worked. But for whatever policy reasons, they weren't given them. And the old reason of, oh, then they will let an aircraft that might otherwise have been saved go down. It was more expensive to train a pilot than to build an aircraft, so that makes no sense. Thank you all.
The question of parachutes, when I was researching for tonight, I found out a really interesting piece of history. the first female pilot in Canada. She became a pilot at the age of 19 when men were allowed, or boys were allowed to be pilots at the age of 17 in 1928. And one of the things she did, she flew out of Hamilton, I believe, was she flew over Burlington Bay and bailed out in a parachute at 2,800 feet above sea level, or above, I guess, ground level. And then she was asked to do the same thing for the Canadian National Exhibition, and her mother said, not a snowball's chance in Hades. So that's sort of an interesting aside. At this time, I'd like to, first of all, call upon Peter to come and thank our guest. Peter is the curator of the Grey Highlands Museum. Peter.
That is bright. Wow. Thought they were making it up, but it is bright. So thank you all for coming. Obviously, thank you so much for chatting today. I just knew that this conversation would have a really lovely connection to me. My father flew in the RCAF, so didn't fly in the First World War, although I might look like I could be the son of someone who flew in the First World War. I'll tell you a little story that I promise will kind of get back to the proper end. I lost my mother in my mid-20s. And I remember at that very time when I lost her, thinking of all the questions that I could have asked and didn't think to ask because I was young and you just don't think you're going to lose your parents. And about a year after I lost my mother, my father reached out and said, I want to do a road trip. And it was one last little bit of nostalgia to just joyously embrace your youth and relive it one more time. And we jumped in his big, chunky blue Buick Riviera, and we went on a road trip. And I'll just tell you about two things that happened. We went to Detroit. He grew up in Detroit, which I didn't know at the time, but we went to Detroit. His father worked at the Detroit Free Press, and we were driving downtown Detroit on Woodward Avenue, I believe it was, and he said, I think I can find my old home. So just off Woodward Avenue, somewhere right in the heart of downtown, we turned, and he immediately, excitedly started looking at the shapes of homes and the numbers on those homes, trying to find his house. And I sat in the passenger seat and noticed on this fairly nice summer's day, there were a lot of people sitting on their porches who immediately started staring at us. And Detroit is a lovely place. I'm sure, is there anyone from Detroit here today before I say something terrible? Detroit's a lovely place. At the time, I was a little bit nervous, and my father could care less. He just wanted to find his home. And slowly, those people on the porches started pointing at us. And a few got off their porches and started walking to the road. And I got a little bit more nervous. And then at the exact moment that my father found his house, so joyously pointed it out to me, is the moment that I realized that in the 60 to 70 years since he lived there, that two-way road had become a one-way road, and we were going the wrong way on a one-way road. And I begged him to leave. And I didn't want to talk about his house. I just not wanted to be attacked at that particular moment in time, and said, can we just keep moving? And we just kept moving. And my memory of that time in Detroit was of that, going down the street the wrong way, as opposed to listening and engaging in his stories of growing up. And the second part of that was almost 2 weeks later, we were in Ottawa. And we went to the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum, which is, I suspect, a lot like your museum on steroids, maybe, with a little bit more funding and a little bit more space. And we're walking through huge buildings and hangars full of airplanes. And in one particular corner, he finds a Hawker Hurricane. And very excitedly starts to tell me, I think, my memory hopefully is correct, that he, when he trained as a young pilot, trained in a Hawker Hurricane. and then started talking about all the reasons why he was not sent overseas, but instead remained in Canada and taught other young pilots to fly those exact same planes. And he looked on the side, and the number on the fuselage seemed to resonate with him, and he thought, that seems familiar. I bet you I flew that very airplane. And he was going to go home, and he was going to look up his old pilot records, and he was going to see if he could connect those dots. And I just wanted to get home. We'd been on the road for 2 weeks, and I'm sure everybody here loves their parents, but 2 weeks with your parents is sometimes a long, long time. And I missed my family, and I missed my kids, and I wanted to get home. And I don't know if he made that connection. And I desperately wish I did, because just a little over a year after that trip, I lost my father. And all I think about is those moments where you want to know more and you don't think to ask. And everyone here has a story. And I bet you not a lot of you have shared your full story with family or friends or written it down. But it is that collective of knowledge that is the very reason museums exist, is to take all those beautiful, individual, detailed stories and become incredibly passionate about what you do, very much like Natalie does, and just shared with us in her presentation. The precision, the intimacy of those individual stories that collectively might not have been as important as the whole. And so I thank you for having the passion to do that and the ability to share a presentation like that and captivating these people in your stories. It's a gem and it's a valuable thing to have, and I thank you for coming here tonight.
Natalie just told me that the first female pilot in Canada's name was Eileen Gollop, and Natalie, sorry? V-O-L-L-I-C-K. See, now I have problems.
Eileen Vollick.
Vollick, yes, V-O-L-L-I-C-K. I read that. From Wyerton, she was born. That's right, raised in Wyerton, and then she moved down to the States. She was married and moved to the upper New York State, I believe it was, or somewhere in the States, anyways. Yep. And that's where she landed on Burlington Bay in 1929 in her airplane on the ice. She had to swim to get out of the parachute. And in case anybody didn't hear that, her mother and her sister watched as she came down and watched when she landed in the water and how the parachute went atop her and she had to swim under it and out of it to get out. What a great story. And you were involved, I believe, Natalie, through the 99s on their website. There's a whole story about her, and you were involved in an event in, was it the museum in Hamilton? Go ahead. Sorry.
Marilyn is really the person who knows about Eileen Vollick. All I did was take the information and put a display up at Canadian Warplanes Heritage, which is the World War II Aviation Museum in Hamilton. That display was highlights Eileen Vollick's uniform, and also it did, but they've recently taken it down, highlighted all the women pilots in the Canadian military. But that part has disappeared recently. I'm sorry to say, stories about women pilots in the military are fascinating.
They certainly are. Ladies and gentlemen, the Friends have asked me to extend congratulations to the Museum Board, who, under Colleen Boer's able leadership as chair, have brought the museum forward to a very special date. This year, 2024, marks the museum's 50th anniversary, and celebratory plans are well underway, as well as specific opportunities to mark the museum anniversary and future in the year 2025. At this point, I would like to introduce the board members and ask them to come forward and just join me here on the stage. First, Colleen Boer, the chair. Emmett Ferguson, not here tonight. Harvey Hutchison, I think I saw Harvey come in. Come on up, Harvey, please. Janet Carson. Rob Fawcett. Sharon Wickens didn't. No. Sharon Wickens is a member but couldn't make it this evening. Stuart Halliday. Let there be whatever. I was going to say let there be light, but please, not right now. Unable to attend was Lynn Silverton, and also Dane Nielsen, the deputy mayor, is a municipal representative. Tom Aldwood is a councillor. He's our councillor. He's also the alternate municipal representative. I will now once again call upon Peter, the Community Heritage Curator, to come out to the mic and give us a peek into promote their anniversary celebration, which is scheduled for Saturday afternoon, December the 14th, at the Flesherton Library, and also to talk about their specific goals for the 2005 in keeping visitors to the museum for extended periods of time. So, Peter.
Thank you. So I won't introduce myself again, and the light's off so I can see everyone, which is fantastic. Indeed, oh, that's great, thank you. Indeed, I happen to be the curator at this museum in a time when we've reached a really significant milestone. 50 years is amazing, and this municipality certainly has changed, because in fact it did not exist when the museum started. So it was a collective of stories and villages that came together to tell their stories in one specific space. And it's been looked after by a number of curators over that time. And I just happen to be the person who's holding the reins right now, but we've taken all the hard work over the years and really sort of changed our stories, the way we tell stories in that very small facility. And we are celebrating our 50th year. We celebrate by telling the stories of people just like you and why you live here and why you have a passion for Grey Highlands. And the one thing that we're going to focus on in 2025 is the same passion, but through creators who live here. So artists, painters and sculptors, poets and writers. If you've chosen Grey Highlands as your muse and decided to live here, we will be celebrating you within our museum in 2025. And we have a community gallery that is full of family stories, and that will be taken over and filled with beautiful artwork for 2025. And one of the things that we're going to do is an outreach, and it is very much thanks to the Friends of the Museum. Last year, and if you've driven by the museum in the last 2 or 3 months, you'll notice at night that our signs illuminated magically. And that is quite literally thanks to the Friends of the Museum, who last year said, how can we help you? And that's one of the things that we wanted to do. We wanted to attract more guests. We wanted to be more visual on the highway, and that was their gift to us, and it's been tremendously successful. I suspect that we've hit record numbers of guests this year. Our attendance has been fantastic. One thing that we're going to do to try to keep guests in this municipality longer is we have an artist who's right now creating literally some artwork that's going to be utilized within our museum stories next year. We've reached out on social media for the last 2 or 3 months asking people to tell us about the most important part of their community. So it doesn't preclude you from living in Flesherton and saying Lake Eugenia, or living in Markdale and saying Flesherton Pond, but everybody had something that they wanted to celebrate. So we got a lot of feedback on what we'll be celebrating, And we are right now creating a 5-color piece of art that will celebrate Grey Highlands and the very unique pieces that are within Grey Highlands. And we're going to get people to explore our community because much like this stamp, that 5-color piece of art is going to be broken up into 5 separate colors, and we're going to have 5 stations scattered throughout Grey Highlands. And you're going to be able to grab a little postcard and go to a station and slip it in so it registers correctly, and you're going to pick up a stamp in that particular location and stamp it, and that will be one color, and then you'll go to another location that has a very different stamp with a very different color, and once you've visited all the stations, you will be creating your own unique piece of art that celebrates Grey Highlands. And so I'm super excited and happy to say that the Friends of the Museum will be partaking, and they will be physically helping us create those stations that you'll be visiting next year. So it's all about coming and visiting us, understanding the incredible story of Grey Highlands, and then staying longer in Grey Highlands. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Catherine and our treasurer, Steve, have a special presentation at this point.
Thank you, Peter, for your description of the 2025 program. Very exciting. We, the Friends, wish to congratulate the museum board and all their achievements to date, and especially on the forthcoming anniversary celebrations. And it is our pleasure to be giving this donation to the museum to assist in bringing their 2025 key goal to fruition. So,
thank you very
Colleen,
much.
And it's our pleasure.
Thank you so much, Steve. The museum board has benefited from the efforts of the Friends of the Museum for several years now, and it is so appreciated to know that we have financial support through you and through your programs, and it's helped us to make it to 50 years, and we're hoping for many, many more. So thank you so very much for your help. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
I would like to say something. So for those of you who didn't get a chance, Natalie's book is on the welcome table, available for $20. It seems to be a book, Natalie, that would be for young people. Maybe you'd like to say a little something.
This is a book about the first airplane that de Havilland designed in Canada. It became the primary trainer of almost over 50 air forces around the world. Sorry?
Speaking to the mic.
Mike. Okay, the de Havilland Chipmunk, the first airplane that de Havilland designed in Canada. It became the primary trainer for 50 air forces around the world. The things in this book are all based on history, but obviously I have squished them together into one story. And although it is somewhat designed as an older kid's book, I have found that I have flying instructors who say they learn things from it. So it's got quite a range in it. I also had the joy of writing it, illustrating it, etc. Yes. That is yours. Oh, they're available out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The book is available, and you can take a look at it and purchase it after today's program. Next, well, first of all, let's give the museum board a big round of applause for all the work they do. It's almost time for tea and coffee and book signing and mingling and meeting with Natalie. And for 3 lucky people present this evening, there are exactly 3 door prizes for tonight. So Catherine and Steve has the basket. I will call Natalie up again in a minute. Can we have you draw the door prizes for us, please?
Sorry,
No problem.
of course. Do I get to shuffle them around first?
Oh, yes,
Sure.
shake them up.
Do I get to find my glasses?
The first door prize is a donation from Artemisia Cheese and Fine Foods in Flesherton.
And it is number 03044-350. Hey, Aki.
The second door prize is a donation of a book. The title of the book is The First Aviators, and it was donated by from Speaking Volumes and Audio in Markdale.
I don't think that's my phone. Zero 348. Hey, the 99s are doing well.
That's the problem with airplane mode, Peggy. You're not on a flight today. Donation, the third one is donation, and it's a gift certificate from the bakery in Flesherton.
Okay, I'll do my best to make it another 99. 03044-349.
So close.
He was there.
Family affair.
Well, you know, we're the luckiest people in the world anyway. So,
Thank you very much. Thanks, Natalie. It's a family affair tonight. This is the final speaker series event for 2024. The programs will begin again in mid-April of next year, 2025. And to be specific, on Thursday evening, May 15th, which isn't really April, but it'll be Thursday evening, May 15th. Is it April 15th? Thank you. So it is April 15th, and it is April 2025. Our first presenter is to be the canoeist, matter of fact, a canoeist extraordinaire, Hap Wilson. So make sure you mark your calendars for that date. We will have reminders to you as we get closer to the event. Coffee and tea are still available, with our most sincere thanks to Highland Grounds for their ongoing generosity in donating their coffee and tea for each of our events. We thank Ron Barnett of Color Picks for creating our posters. As always, we wish to sincerely acknowledge the support of this speaker series by the good folks here at Annesley United Church. And of course, thank you, Tim Riley, for all the time that you've given to ensuring the needed technological support. We couldn't do this without you. A special thanks to Stephen's Restaurant of Markdale for their support of meals, to Artemisia Cheese and Fine Foods of Flesherton for their ongoing support, and always our appreciation to the municipality of Grey Highlands for their support. Very, very big thank you to the Friends of the Museum for making this presentation possible, and especially to Steve, Catherine, Jane, and Barry, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight. Let's give them a big round of applause. And of course, our special presenter, who we've acknowledged and cannot say enough about for the most wonderful presentation tonight. Thank you very much, Natalie. Once again, thanks to each and every one of you for your continued support, for being here tonight. We invite you to coffee and tea. I'm Terry Mokry, your MC, wishing you the best wishes in the upcoming Christmas and holiday seasons. God bless, and we'll see you next year.